In the 1st century AD, 3 men departed from ancient Seleucia in Syria and sailed on board an ancient ship to the island of Cyprus. These 3 men were called Barnabas, Saul, and John Mark. And they were on their first missionary journey to spread the good news that Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, had been crucified in Jerusalem and had risen from the dead. When they arrived at Salamis, they preached the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews and made their way through the island until they came to Paphos. The events which I am exploring are written about in the New Testament and the Lucan narrative, the Acts of the Apostles. In Acts 13, verses 6 to 12, Luke focuses upon an event where Paul, then Saul, rebuked Elymas the sorcerer who sought to persuade the Proconsul away from the testimony which St. Paul was delivering. Paul, then Saul, famously rebuked the sorcerer and he became blind. Recent archaeological discoveries at Paphos have revealed fresh insights into the lives of its ancient inhabitants, and these finds have also complemented Luke's historical narrative in Acts of the Apostles. They have also demonstrated the accuracy of the text.
Acts chapter 13, verses 4 to 12. So, being sent out by the Holy Spirit, they went down to Seleucia, and from there they sailed to Cyprus. When they arrived at Salamis, they proclaimed the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews, and they had John to assist them. When they had gone through the whole island as far as Paphos, they came upon a certain magician, a Jewish false prophet named Barjesus. He was with the Proconsul Sergius Paulus, a man of intelligence, who summoned Barnabas and Saul and sought to hear the word of God. But Elymas the magician, for that is the meaning of his name, opposed them, seeking to turn the Proconsul away from the faith. But Saul, who was also called Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked intently at him and said, "You son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, full of all deceit and villainy, will you not stop making crooked the straight paths of the Lord? And now, behold, the hand of the Lord is upon you, and you will be blind and unable to see the sun for a time." Immediately a mist and darkness fell upon him, and he went about seeking people to lead him by the hand. Then the Proconsul believed when he saw what had occurred, for he was astonished at the teaching of the Lord. Now Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia.
Today we know more about ancient Paphos than ever before, and recent archaeological discoveries have revealed this even further. Along with ancient writings and historical documents and the finds of archaeology, we now know the ancient Roman road which led from Salamis to Paphos, a road which led to the original city walls and gates.
I'm standing in the probable location for where Barnabas, Paul and John Mark entered through the gates of the city and into Paphos. The original Roman walls are in this area, as are the original gates, at least 2 of them. We cannot be absolutely certain which gate they entered through. It could have been the northwest gate or the north gate, but either way, this area gives us somewhat of an idea of where these people came in to the ancient city of Paphos.
Today, the modern city of Paphos, with its villas, tourism shopping centres, restaurants and somewhat picturesque harbour, holds proudly to its ancient heritage. But in the 1st century AD, when the apostles walked this land, they were crashing through the ancient cities proclaiming that Jesus was the Messiah, and they were speaking against the ancient mythical pagan gods of their day, and they would have certainly rattled some ancient cages. And one such tradition concerning St. Paul's visit affirms that Paul indeed received a number of backlashes.
Behind me is a pillar known as St. Paul's Pillar. Local Cypriot legend has it that St. Paul was tied to this pillar and given the 40 lashes minus 1 by the Jews. There is no actual evidence for this claim, since Luke in Acts makes no mention of it, but Paul does refer to a similar event in his letter to the Corinthians, in which he states, 5 times from the Jews I received the 40 lashes minus 1. Obviously it would be an assumption to assume this was the same event, but nevertheless we have some written form of something, so who knows? Maybe it's true.
Ancient writings from the likes of Roman historian Josephus and church historian Eusebius inform us of the horrors of the Roman flagrum, but Paul in his letter to the Corinthians does not claim that he was beaten by the Romans but by the Jews, and the term which he uses, the 40 lashes minus 1, was a term used to describe the whip, which contained 3 lashes which when applied 13 times equaled that of 39 lashes. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. Thrice I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I've been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils in waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils amongst false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. The ancient pillar known as St. Paul's Pillar is consistent with that of the Roman era, and the legend that St. Paul was scourged on this pillar may well be true, but I've come here to Archaeology to find out more of the history of this claim.
So I've just received this little piece of information here, a historical outline, which is a little paper here found at Archaeology, of which describes the systematic historical outline of the events here at Archaeology. Apparently, AD 45, St. Paul and Barnabas came to Cyprus, Paphos. No mention of Mark in this document. 365 AD, a major earthquake in Cyprus destroys much of Paphos. Same year, soon after the earthquake, the basilica in Paphos is started. This was apparently the largest one in Cyprus and probably the seat of the Bishop of Cyprus, or the Bishop of Paphos. The Bishop's Palace apparently is over to the left of the site looking from Archaeology. AD 536, the Bishop Sergius of Paphos refurbishes the basilica. It becomes a 5-aisled church which is designed being followed in the basilicas elsewhere in the area. AD 653, we find the basilica is destroyed by Arab invasion. 900 AD, that's 10th century, a small Byzantine church is built where Archaeology now stands. 1220 AD, St. Francis visits Cyprus and Paphos. Same year, a major earthquake damages Paphos, possibly damaging Archaeology. 13th and 14th centuries, the Franciscan church is built above 4 caves known as St. Paul's cells. So what are these cells? I don't know, it's the first I've heard of these cells. So apparently this church was built upon an earlier foundation of some sort. 14th century Archaeology is refurbished to the present church and plaster painted church. 1540, here we have the first mention of St. Paul's pillar. Apparently this Franciscan church was refurbished by the Crusaders, incorporating St. Paul's pillar in the entranceway. 1573, Turks invade Cyprus, Franciscan church becomes a mosque, Archaeology is left alone. 1600, the Franciscan church collapses, leaving only Archaeology. And then obviously we come to the more modern times, and by 1986 the church is derelict and it's entrusted to the local Catholic community. 1988, which is more modern, again the Anglican community accept an invitation to Archaeology for worship. Obviously this is an ecumenical agenda, but the 1540 is the first date, apparently, according to this document, that St. Paul's pillar is mentioned as being incorporated by the Crusaders in the entrance hall, or the entranceway. So is St. Paul's pillar as it stands today the same as it would have stood when it was first brought here, or is there any historical reality to it whatsoever, or is it just a myth from the 16th century by the Crusaders?
The suggested date that St. Paul's pillar was placed at the entrance of the medieval church is consistent with the archaeological finds at the site. Many of these remains have been dated as early as 4th century AD and as late as the 16th century AD. It is also suggested that earlier remains lie beneath. But since there is no actual evidence that Paul ever came to this site, and there is no evidence to suggest otherwise, the matter is a simple one. Either you believe it, or you don't. Although it is at the site of St. Paul's pillar at Archaeology where St. Paul receives the most attention, Luke in Acts writes about an event where St. Paul, then Saul, held an audience with the Roman governor Sergius Paulus, and it is at the archaeological site near the modern harbour where archaeologists have made some intriguing discoveries which affirm the Lucan narrative.
In 1965, Polish archaeologists excavated here at near Paphos. Their excavations revealed evidence that this area, which is known as Paphos Archaeological Site, is the seat of the Roman Proconsul. The excavations themselves reveal foundations and buildings as early as 2nd century AD and are distinctly Roman. This area in which I'm standing is what's known as the Villa of Paphos. It's one of the largest villas in the Mediterranean and the largest on Cyprus. And it's here where I believe that little touch of faith and archaeology meet together, of where the archaeology confirms the accuracy of the New Testament. And it's here. It's in this reception room. Here. This 2nd century hall behind me is the probable location of where the Roman proconsul would have held his audiences. It is likely that in a room such as this, Paul would have encountered Sergius Paulus. The horseshoe-shaped asp at the back of the room is where the proconsul would have sat.
You son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, will you not stop perverting the right ways of the Lord? And now, behold, the hand of the Lord is against you, and you will be blind, and for a time you will be unable to see the light of the sun. In 58 BC, the Romans invaded Cyprus, and in 27 BC it became a senatorial province. And by the time Paul, then Saul, and Barnabas and Mark visited the island, it was governed by the Proconsul, as stated in Acts 13 and 7. It is clear that in this account, history and the New Testament agree perfectly. And it is at this villa, known because of its fine mosaics as the Villa of Paphos, which is just one of many places where archaeology and the Lucan narrative walk hand in hand, archaeologists continue to excavate at Paphos archaeological site. And their finds have uncovered some wonderful relics. And although the foundations which remain at the villa do in fact date to the 2nd century AD, or so it is said, this does not exclude the site as being the actual place of Paul's encounter with Sergius Paulus. On the contrary, in fact, we could conclude that if the site is 2nd century AD, as suggested by historians and archaeologists, then it is more plausible that the Roman official built this villa upon earlier houses of the Hellenistic and Roman periods. What is clear is that although it has become somewhat of a commonplace for many modern scholars, historians and archaeologists to criticize the accuracy of the New Testament, and their claims do spread out to the wider world, the Bible has a habit of vindicating itself time and time again.
Over the years, the New Testament has received a considerable amount of criticism. Claims that it is historically inaccurate, and characters such as Luke have no historical authority. But much of these conclusions are made from speculative archaeology and one-sided scholarship and narrow criticism of the text and subject to interpretation of certain passages. But places such as this do actually describe somewhat of the accuracy of the let's say for the sake of context, the Acts of the Apostles, of its accuracy, its historical authority. And places such as this do somewhat confirm that. I have certain questions concerning the claims that so many scholars make today concerning their criticisms of the New Testament, and I think the case needs to be freshly reviewed and fresh evidence brought forth. Because there was a time when scholars or historians or archaeologists said that Luke, in his narrative and his claim here that there was a proconsul at Paphos, and his scholars said there's no evidence for that whatsoever. But that is no longer the case. In 1966, this place was excavated, and archaeologists found this site, and through a Latin inscription found that there was, in fact, a proconsul here at Paphos. But somehow, I imagine Luke sat maybe in Jerusalem or maybe in Philippi, saying to archaeologists, if he was still here, I'm speaking purely speculative, as if to say, you mean you've only just found that out? I knew that 2,000 years ago. One thing that I do notice about places like this is, although there isn't a great deal of mention of St. Paul here in places such as Paphos, of which I think there could be more mention of him, there is likewise and even lesser mention of men such as Mark, the gospel writer Mark, the man of whom Paul travelled with on this journey, and he came here with Paul and Barnabas, and likewise his gospel narrative was dictated by St. Peter, of whom he transcribed for the words of St. Peter, as church history revealed. And he barely gets such as much as mention in places like this. And likewise Barnabas, who was a resident of this island and one of the 70 disciples who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus, he barely gets so much as a mention. And yet he was from the western side of the island, which is Salamis, and yet he's barely given is mentioned, as I've previously said, and I think it's somewhat of a tragedy through much of westernized Christianity and of places such as this, which are largely dominated by tradition. I would say that I think, as I repeat, it is a tragedy of some sort that men like Mark, whose feet may have graced this very land, here in this very place, which I think he certainly did, is not mentioned. And likewise Barnabas, the man who witnessed amongst the 70 the resurrection of Jesus, is not mentioned. I think that is a tragedy. In 2007, I visited near Paphos for the first time. I did this as part of my research into the archaeology of the New Testament. Back then, I was surprised at how little, if any, mention there was of the events of Acts chapter 13 connected to this archaeological site. Upon my return in 2012, I'm equally as surprised, if not more, as I was back then, of how little, if any, mention at all this place gives to the events of Acts chapter 13. Surely you'd think that the events that Luke wrote about would be part of the history of this place. Surely it would be part of its appeal. But still, there is no mention of it. I'm quite amazed at the amount of evangelical Christians who visit these sites and desire a little bit more information upon what actually happened here, where these ideas came from, and where the archaeological connection between Paphos and the Bible, of a little bit more information on it, of which they don't have. While I've been here, there's been numerous occasions of me speaking with evangelical Christians and Christians about the information which I have found from here through my own research, but of which little they have found in the actual place itself. What strikes me about the way Luke writes in Acts of the Apostles is that when you visit places like Paphos, you see the close-knit feeling or impression that the writing gives, that Luke is writing to a first century people. So the context of Acts of the Apostles is that he's writing to a Roman official. The Roman official knows the circumstances, the context, the different cultures and environments that Luke is writing about. So when he writes about a place like this, of Paphos in Cyprus, he writes in the sense that the person knows what is in that environment. So if he's writing to the Roman official knows already about the Proconsul and the seat of the Proconsul here at Paphos. So Luke need not cover certain areas that need not covering. So he writes within the city walls. So if he mentions Paphos, the first century reader knows what Paphos is like. He doesn't need to say, now at Paphos we have this harbour, or we have this or that. The writer already knows that the person that he's writing to already knows that these things are there, so he need not mention them. So it's the close-knit feeling that the writer gives and the book of Acts gives when you visit the places where the events happen that he wrote about. The city walls in Paphos, the original city walls, and it's not a very big city. So the events that took place in Paphos took place within those walls. So if, for example, if Luke writes that Paul, Barnabas and Mark came to Paphos, he need not write that down this avenue or down this street the Paul went and preached to the synagogue of the Jews, or the people at the synagogues of the Jews, and he was given the 39 lashes, the 40 lashes minus 1. You need not mention those aspects, because really it's almost like receiving a parking ticket for a fine. You preach in the first century to the head synagogues. You preach Christ to them, you will be beaten. That is what the context of the first century pretty much is. So Luke need not mention that, because it's almost just, well, what else do we expect? What else do we expect? He's going to be beaten for preaching Christ to the Jews. So if Paul was beaten and given the 39 lashes, which is just over this way, then Luke need not mention it. What Luke is interested in this particular passage, distinctly where he mentions that when Paul comes here, he is under the name of Saul, but then when he goes there to the harbour, he is named Paul. And this is distinctly because of the connection with Sergius Paulus, that Paul is now entering into Roman territory. So he now refers to himself under his Roman name. It's not that Paul had a name change from Saul to Paul. They're both the same name. It's just that Paul is the Roman variant of his name, whereas Saul is the Jewish. So the Jews had rejected the gospel. Now Paul is entering into Roman territory. This is what brings this text to such a fascinating status, that this place here, this is where it all happened. This is where Gentile Christianity began, of where Paul is now impacting the Roman Empire. I'm coming towards the end of my journey now here on the island of Cyprus, and my time here at Paphos. During my time here, I have found Luke's narrative to be accurate. I have found his text to be straight to the point. I have found his text to be clear, precise, and contextual about what Luke is trying to communicate. I've found him to be a writer who doesn't mention things that he doesn't need to mention. I found him to be a writer that doesn't particularly dwell on issues that are not subject to where he's trying to aim with his writing. And I found him to be entirely accurate with history. I think that when people visit places like this, Paphos, and they take the New Testament, they read the New Testament in the place where these events happened, and in the places where these letters and where these books were written, I think they give a completely different insight into the text itself. I think it's a very dangerous thing to view the Gospels or view the New Testament through the eyes of westernized Christianity or through Western spectacles. I think that's a very dangerous and diabolical thing to do. I think you need to know the times, the places, the historical aspects, the culture. I think you need to know the whole atmosphere that surrounds the places of the New Testament. And I think until people do that, I don't think that anybody will particularly grasp the entire New Testament. That's my take on it. That's what I believe. And I believe that my time here has been fruitful, and I believe the New Testament will continue to be fruitful. However, before my journey is over, I think that I have one more trip to take.
Luke in Acts wrote of how following this event of Paul's conversion of the Roman official to the faith, that Paul, then Saul, no longer referred to himself as Saul, but according to his Roman name of Paul. Acts 13 and 9 records no mere name change, since Roman citizens such as Paul had as many as 3 names. What is clear is that Paul was now taking the gospel of Jesus Christ into Roman territory, and although the name of the now converted Roman official, Sergius Paulus, is remarkably similar to that of St. Paul, the meaning is clear. And it was at this port, at Paphos, where Acts 13:13 first refers to Saul as Paul. This event is one of the most significant events of Cypriot history, and indeed the Christianized Western world, and it was at this harbour where that significant change occurred. Although the modern harbour at Paphos has changed somewhat since the 1st century AD, evidence of the original harbour remains. And one of the locals was kind enough to show me from these waters clear details concerning the ancient harbour and its current restricted uses. And it is at this harbour where the ancient remains of where the apostles boarded upon the ancient ship are still visible to this day.
These large rocks here that remain along the coastline are what remains of the original harbour from the time of the apostles. Ships were moored here, and this is where boarding would have taken place, if not here, somewhere along this coastline. You can still see the original rocks when you stand along the coast. And this section of the story concludes at this harbour, or at least the Roman harbour that existed in the time of the apostles, where Luke in Acts 13 and 13 says that Paul, Barnabas and John Mark set sail from this harbour to Perga in Pamphylia. So it was from this harbour where they set sail, and it is now from this harbour where I conclude my journey of a nice cruise on these waters.